The sound of sirens echoed down the quiet street as Marcus walked through the checkpoint. He was just trying to make it home after a long day. But as he neared the blockade, a white female officer's eyes locked onto him. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her voice sharp and filled with suspicion.
Hey, stop right there. What do you think you're doing here?
She barked, her eyes scanning him with disdain. Marcus paused, his heart racing, but not because of fear. Something in him was already preparing for what would come next. It was a bitterly cold morning, the kind that seemed to freeze everything in place. Time, thoughts, and even the unspoken tension between the two people on the street. Officer Rachel Hayes, her breath forming icy clouds in the frigid air, stood at the corner of the street near the local convenience store, her posture rigid. She was tall, blonde, and the epitome of what most would expect from a law enforcement officer in this small, predominantly white town. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her badge shining bright. She had always been a staunch believer in law and order, at least the version she had been taught to uphold. But that morning, something had snapped inside her. It wasn't just the biting cold, it was the sting of frustration, of having been passed over for promotions for years. The officers who had risen faster were always quicker to fall in line with the unspoken biases that governed her precinct. Today, it was personal. She had heard rumors that a new person was coming to town. Someone big, a new face, a new voice, and more than anything, someone who threatened to shake the foundation of everything she had worked so hard to control. The rumors were true. She had seen him earlier, a man in his late 30s, tall with broad shoulders, his dark skin standing out in a crowd of mostly white officers as they greeted him with nods and handshakes. As she stood on the corner, Rachel's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had he been chosen? She couldn't shake the feeling that her world, the world she had fought so hard to maintain in her own image, was about to be turned upside down. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she didn't even see him coming. She didn't notice his calm, deliberate stride until he was directly in front of her. Marcus King, the new police chief of the department, a man whose reputation had preceded him, known for his commitment to justice, his years of experience, and his unwavering moral compass. He wasn't just another officer. He was the embodiment of everything that many in the town had feared for years: change, progress, and a challenge to the old ingrained system of power. Rachel's heart raced. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, her discomfort turning into something darker. He was nothing like the officers she had worked alongside. He didn't have the same guarded expressions or the same silent approval of the status quo. No, Marcus was a man who had fought for his place. He wasn't just a product of privilege. He was someone who had earned everything he had. He had walked through the fire of systemic racism, fought battles both on the street and in the courtrooms, and emerged victorious. But to Rachel, that was precisely the problem. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Marcus's voice. "Morning, Officer Hayes," Marcus said, his tone calm, professional. He nodded at her, acknowledging her presence. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no hint of superiority, just the quiet assurance of someone who had been through enough to know what mattered, and more importantly, what didn't. "Morning," Rachel replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world was watching. Rachel couldn't contain herself anymore. All of her frustration, her years of feeling overlooked and underappreciated, boiled over in an instant. Without thinking, she took a step forward, her face flushed with anger. "You think you're just going to come in here and change everything?" she spat out, the words like daggers leaving her lips. "You think you're better than all of us because you've got a badge and a title? You don't know anything about this town, about these people. We've worked hard to make this place what it is." Marcus looked at her, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with people like her before. He knew what she was really saying. She was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of losing the system that had allowed her to rise in power. But Marcus also knew that fear was the enemy of progress. It was the foundation of discrimination and the walls that kept communities divided. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, his voice measured. "I don't know everything about this town, but I'm here to learn. I'm here to make things better for everyone." Rachel's anger flared. She took another step toward him, her eyes filled with disdain. "Better for everyone? You think that's what this is about? You don't belong here. You're just another outsider trying to tell us how to run things. You don't get to come in here and tell me what's best." With that, in an act of uncontrollable rage, Rachel did something that would change everything. She spat on Marcus. The saliva hit the front of his uniform with a sickening splat, a symbolic act of defiance that reverberated through the air. The shock was immediate. The world seemed to freeze for a moment, as if time itself had paused to witness what had just transpired. Marcus stood still, his eyes wide, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't retaliate. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady, and then he took a slow, deliberate step back. Rachel stood there, breathless, her chest heaving with the force of her own anger. Her eyes searched his face for a reaction. She wanted him to react, to show weakness, to crumble in front of her. But he didn't. Instead, Marcus wiped his uniform, taking his time, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't know me, Officer Hayes," he said quietly. "But you will. You'll know who I am and what I stand for. And I won't allow you to treat me or anyone else like this again." As he spoke, his voice carried a weight that no amount of anger or prejudice could diminish. In that moment, Rachel realized something she hadn't considered before. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. The struggle for equality, for justice, for dignity. Those were the things that mattered, not the petty grievances of a woman trying to hold on to a system she had outgrown. And in that moment, she saw Marcus for what he was. A man of integrity, of courage, and of resolve. The new chief, the one who was about to change everything. Rachel stood there, frozen, as Marcus turned and walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. The world had shifted, but it wasn't until that moment that she realized it. The old guard was gone. The winds of change had come, and they were here to stay. The silence that followed Marcus's departure seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the entire world had collectively held its breath. Rachel stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She had acted out of frustration, out of years of repressed resentment, but now, in the aftermath of her impulsive act, she was confronted with an entirely new set of emotions. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the sting of her own actions or the eerie calmness with which Marcus had responded. Behind her, the officers who had witnessed the exchange stood silently, some pretending to remain focused on their work, others unable to hide the looks of shock or disapproval in their eyes. Rachel could feel their eyes on her, but it was the absence of Marcus's reaction that gnawed at her. He hadn't yelled, hadn't retaliated, hadn't even seemed rattled by the insult. Instead, he had turned the situation around, using his dignity and composure as a shield against her venom. It was a subtle shift, but Rachel began to feel it. A new sense of power, a quiet authority, radiated from him. A power that wasn't built on control or fear, but on something far more profound. She had expected him to crumble, to shout, to make a scene. But instead, he had walked away with a level of calmness that left her feeling small, like a child who had been caught in the wrong. The day dragged on in a blur, Rachel's mind consumed with the encounter. It was impossible for her to focus on her work, and every time she caught sight of Marcus, her stomach tightened. She had expected him to be angry, to demand an apology, to retaliate in some way. But nothing. She couldn't get the image of him calmly wiping the spit from his shirt out of her mind. How could he stand there, unaffected? Didn't he feel the humiliation? Didn't he feel the weight of her words? Or was he simply above it all? Later that day, as she stood by her locker, her hands trembling as she changed into her civilian clothes, her phone buzzed. A message from a colleague she barely knew, a message that would send a shockwave through her chest. "Marcus is the new police chief. He's been appointed to replace the old chief starting next week." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be true, could it? She reread the message several times, each time the reality of it sinking deeper into her consciousness. The man she had insulted, spat on, was not just another officer. He was the new leader, the one who would guide the department. The one who would now hold the power to shape the future of the force, and perhaps even the city itself. She quickly scrolled through her notifications, and sure enough, there it was, a news article confirming the announcement. It was official. Marcus King, the man she had treated like dirt, was now her boss. Her hands gripped the edge of the locker as her thoughts raced. She could feel the weight of her actions crashing down on her. This wasn't just about a single incident, it was about everything. The years of frustration, the doubts she had buried deep inside, and the simmering resentment that had fueled her outburst. But now, as the realization of what she had done truly settled in, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling of regret. She had no idea how to face him now, no idea how to undo the damage. There was no way to take back the words, no way to take back the spit. She had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. As she left the station that evening, the world outside seemed different. The cold air, the fading light of the day, it all felt distant, as though she were moving through a dream. She had to confront him. There was no escaping that. But what could she possibly say? How could she apologize for something so irredeemable? The next day, the tension at the precinct was palpable. Officers moved through the halls with a sense of unease, whispers following them like shadows. Word had spread quickly. Marcus's appointment had taken everyone by surprise, especially Rachel. The notion of Marcus being the new chief was so foreign to her that she couldn't grasp it. But it was real, and soon, she would have to face him. That afternoon, as she walked toward his office, her mind raced. She could hear her footsteps echoing off the polished floors, each step a reminder of the mess she had created. When she reached his door, she hesitated. It felt like a lifetime before she finally knocked, a simple rap on the door that sounded like a drumbeat in her ears. "Come in," Marcus's voice called from within. Rachel's heart raced as she pushed the door open. She had seen him around the precinct, but now, as her boss, he seemed untouchable, his presence towering in a way that it hadn't before. His back was to her as he looked over some papers, his posture relaxed yet authoritative. The office smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood. "Sir," Rachel began, her voice faltering as she stepped into the room. Marcus didn't turn at first. He continued to go through the documents on his desk, his face unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, before he finally spoke. "Officer Hayes," he said, his tone calm, but there was a note of something else in it, something she couldn't quite place. He looked up then, meeting her gaze for the first time since that fateful moment outside the diner. His expression was still calm, composed. But beneath that, there was something deeper, something guarded. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. I was out of line yesterday. What I said, what I did, there's no excuse for it. I don't even know why I did it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with quiet intensity. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment. Just the same unshakable calm that he had shown on the street, the same unbothered composure. It was as if he had already forgiven her without needing to say it aloud. "You don't have to apologize, Rachel," he said finally. "What you did, it's in the past. And I'm here now, ready to work with you." Rachel blinked, stunned. That wasn't what she had expected. He wasn't going to throw her out. He wasn't going to make an example out of her. He was simply moving forward, just like that. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus gave a small nod, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "I know this town. I know this department," he said, his voice firm now. "And I know we've got a lot of work to do. I'm not here to hold grudges. I'm here to do what's best for everyone. For this department, for this community." He paused, then added with a soft smile, "I hope you're with me on that." For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. The weight that had settled on her chest began to lift, and she felt the possibility of something new, something better, on the horizon. "I'm with you," she said, her voice clear now. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but Rachel realized that this moment, this quiet exchange between them, had set the tone for what was to come. And with that, something inside her shifted. The walls she had built around herself, the bitterness, the resentment, slowly, they began to crumble. And maybe, just maybe, this new chapter could be different. The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and tense moments as Marcus settled into his new role as the police chief. His rise to power had shaken the precinct to its core, and while some welcomed the change, others remained skeptical. Rachel felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her every time she walked into the precinct. The undercurrent of unease, the whispers, the looks, it was all too familiar. But there was something different now. It wasn't just Marcus's presence that commanded respect. It was his ability to move past the divisions that had existed for so long. His presence was one of quiet authority, not intimidation. Rachel had always assumed that power came from loud voices and forceful actions. She had been taught that the only way to survive in a world like theirs was to fight for your space, to demand your place at the table. But Marcus had shown her another way. It wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about standing firm in your truth, in your dignity, even when the world tried to break you down. Her interactions with him after that fateful meeting had been minimal, but when their paths did cross, Rachel felt a quiet but profound shift within herself. Marcus spoke to her like an equal, like someone who had earned his place, not because of his title, but because of the man he was. It wasn't lost on Rachel that she was being given a second chance to prove herself, to learn from her mistakes. Marcus had no reason to be kind to her, no reason to offer her the space to grow. Yet, he had, and that made all the difference. One morning, as Rachel made her way to the briefing room, she overheard a conversation between two officers. It was one of those conversations that was supposed to be private, but they didn't care who overheard. The subject was Marcus. The discussion was full of skepticism, veiled with a thin layer of respect, but underneath it all, there was still doubt. "I don't care what they say about him being the new chief," one of the officers said, shaking his head. "He's one of them. The kind of guy who doesn't know what it's like for people like us." Rachel stopped in her tracks. She knew who them referred to. She had seen that same mindset at play for years. The belief that anyone who wasn't born into their world, anyone who didn't look like them, couldn't possibly understand the struggles they faced. Her gut tightened, and she felt the familiar urge to speak up, to defend Marcus, to tell them all how wrong they were. But something held her back. Instead, she took a deep breath and kept walking. For the first time, she realized that maybe speaking wasn't the answer. Maybe it was enough just to let them see Marcus for who he truly was. Let them witness the kind of leader he had already proven to be. Over the next few weeks, the city watched as Marcus began to implement changes. The atmosphere at the precinct began to shift slowly but surely. His approach wasn't flashy. He didn't walk into a room and demand respect. He simply showed up every day, committed to the work, committed to his duty, and committed to the people he served. He listened to the officers, took their concerns seriously, and most importantly, made it clear that their voices mattered. The respect he commanded wasn't given through threats or promises of power. It was earned through his actions, through his willingness to do what was right, no matter how difficult. Rachel started to see things differently. She saw the power in his quiet strength, the courage it took to face the same people who had once looked down on him and still show up, unbroken. She had never truly understood that kind of resilience before, resilience that didn't require loud gestures or empty threats. It was a resilience that came from within, from knowing who you were and standing firm in that truth. One afternoon, as Rachel walked to her desk, Marcus caught her eye. He was deep in conversation with another officer, but when he saw her, he excused himself and walked over to her. "Officer Hayes," he said with that familiar calmness. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Rachel nodded, unsure of what to expect. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she thought of the past. The spitting incident, the anger she had felt, the regret that still lingered. But when she looked at Marcus, all she saw was a man who had moved beyond that moment, a man who had chosen to move forward. "I've been thinking," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "about the way things have been going around here. I want to thank you for your professionalism. You've been handling yourself well. I know things aren't always easy, but I appreciate how you've been stepping up." Rachel blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had always been the one who did her job, who kept her head down, who avoided confrontation. But now she realized she had to stand tall. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady, her pride in her work rising. "I'm just doing my job." Marcus smiled, the first time she had seen him smile since that day. "You're doing more than that," he said, "and I want to make sure you know you're being recognized for it. I'm glad to have you on this team, Rachel. We need more officers who understand the work we do here. Officers who understand the importance of leadership in all its forms." She felt something shift within her then. It wasn't just Marcus's words that made her feel seen. It was the weight of his actions, the consistency with which he showed up, the integrity with which he led. As the days went on, Rachel felt herself change. She no longer felt like the outsider in her own department. She no longer felt small. She felt part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. Marcus had shown her that leadership wasn't about titles or positions. It was about character, about doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. And with that, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a team. The change wasn't just in the precinct, it was in her, too. The woman who had once been caught in the cycle of self-doubt and frustration now stood firm in her beliefs, ready to take on whatever challenges came her way. And Marcus, the man who had faced down prejudice, who had faced ridicule, who had been underestimated his whole life, he had risen, not just to the position of police chief, but to the man who had proven to them all that resilience, dignity, and integrity were the true markers of power. And together, they were ready to rewrite the future.